James Harlow found the little girl face down in the snow and thought she was dead. He hit the ground before Buck stopped moving. He turned her over with both hands. Her lips were gray, her eyes were closed. He pressed his ear to her chest and heard nothing for 1 second that lasted the rest of his life. And then a heartbeat. Faint. Slow. There. He looked up. A woman was on her knees in the drift 10 feet away, digging with bare, bleeding hands. Not screaming, not crying, just digging. A boy stood behind her holding a lantern. 12 years old. Alone on a Montana road in a blizzard with his family dying in the snow. James Harlow looked at all three of them and made the only decision a man with a conscience could make. He picked the girl up and said, "We're going, right now, all of you." That decision would cost him everything, and he would make it again without hesitation. If this story moves something in you, please subscribe to this channel and hit that bell. We put out new stories every single week. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. James Harlow had not spoken his wife's name in 4 years. Not because he had forgotten, not because the grief had eased into something a man could live around without bleeding, but because saying her name out loud made her real again, and making her real again meant losing her again. And he had decided somewhere in the winter after the burial that he did not have enough left in him to survive losing her twice. Her name was Caroline. He did not say it. He worked instead. He worked the Montana land the way the land required, without stopping, without mercy, without the luxury of a day that was just for sitting and thinking. Because thinking led to Caroline, and Caroline led to the child buried beside her in the south field, the child who never drew a breath loud enough to call a cry. They had decided to name her Grace before. He didn't say that name either. He was checking the north fence at 4:30 when the sky turned the color that meant trouble. Not the soft gray of an ordinary snowstorm. The flat, pressed-down gray of a blizzard that has already decided what it's going to do and is simply arriving to do it. The wind had dropped an hour ago. That was what worried him. Wind dropping before a blizzard wasn't mercy. It was the storm drawing breath. He turned Buck toward home. He found them 3/4 of a mile from his gate. The wagon had caught a buried rut and gone over hard onto its right side, and everything in it had spilled into the snow. 2 trunks, a crate, a roll of canvas that might have been bedding. The rear axle was snapped clean. It was not fixable on a road in a blizzard. It was not fixable tonight. James saw the woman first, on her knees in the drift, digging with her bare hands, not screaming, not calling out, just working at the snow with the methodical focus of a person who has moved past panic into something harder and quieter. Her hands were bleeding. He could see it from 20 feet away, the dark stain of it against the white. He saw the boy second, standing behind her, with a lantern in both hands, jaw locked, not crying. The expression on his face was not a child's expression. It was the expression of someone who has already spent their fear and is now running on something that won't run out as easily. He saw the girl last. She was sitting against the overturned wheel, with her knees pulled to her chest and her eyes closed, and her face the color of old ash. James was off Buck before the horse stopped moving. He crossed the ground in 4 strides. He dropped to his knees in the snow beside the girl. He turned her over with both hands and put his ear to her chest and heard nothing. 1 full second of nothing. And then a heartbeat. Faint. Too slow. But there. "Hey." He took her face in both hands. "Hey, open your eyes, right now." Her eyes opened, dark brown, unfocused. "What's your name?" "Eliza," a thread of a voice. "Eliza, I'm James. I'm going to pick you up." He picked her up. She weighed almost nothing. That frightened him more than anything else on that road. He stood and turned. The woman had stopped digging. She was on her feet, and she was looking at him the way a person looks when they've been let down enough times that hope has become something they approach carefully, from the side, like a horse they don't fully trust. "Who are you?" Her voice was steady. Her hands were shaking. "James Harlow. I've got a ranch 1/2 mile north." He looked at Eliza's face, then back at the woman. "Ma'am, this child is in trouble. We need to move, right now. The storm's 10 minutes out." "I'm not leaving my trunks." "You leave the trunks, or you leave the child. Pick one." She stared at him. He held her eyes and waited. "Thomas," she said. "Yes, ma'am." The boy was already moving. "Small trunk only. Leave everything else." She looked at James. "I'm Margaret Cole. My children are Thomas and Eliza. I pay my way. Whatever you offer, I work for." "Yes, ma'am. We'll settle that later. Let's go." She didn't argue. He noted that. They moved fast. Thomas got the small trunk tied to Buck's saddle without being shown how. Margaret mounted without help. James passed Eliza up to her, and Margaret took her daughter against her chest with both arms, the way a woman holds something she has almost lost, tight and silent, and not letting go. James took the reins and led them up the road. The storm hit before they reached the gate. He didn't say anything about that either. He just walked faster. The ranch house was dark when they came up the drive. James got them inside and got the kitchen stove fed and burning in under 4 minutes. He lit the lamp. He looked at Eliza, who Margaret had set in the chair closest to the stove, Caroline's chair, which James registered and set aside. And he saw that the girl's color was already shifting, the gray going out of it, pink starting to come back in. He released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Back bedroom," he said. "Warmest room in the house. You and your daughter take it." Margaret looked at him. "And Thomas?" "Front room. I've got spare blankets." He was already moving toward the hall. "There's a basin in the kitchen. Water on the stove's almost hot. Your hands need cleaning." "I'm fine." He stopped. He turned around. He looked at her hands, cracked open across the knuckles, blood dried dark against the cold skin. And then he looked at her face. "No," he said. "You're not. But you will be." She opened her mouth. "Mrs. Cole." He said it quietly, but directly. "Let me help you. That's all I'm asking." Something moved across her face. Brief, like a door opened and closed fast before the cold got in. Then she sat down at the table and put her hands out. He cleaned them without speaking. She didn't make a sound. Thomas sat across the table watching, and Eliza had fallen asleep in the chair before the stove, and the storm screamed against the walls, and the lamp held. When James finished wrapping Margaret's hands, she looked down at them for a moment. She didn't thank him. He didn't need her to. He stood and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her and sat down at the other end of the table. She wrapped both bandaged hands around the cup. "Where were you coming from?" he asked. "Colorado, Cripple Creek." She drank. "My husband worked the Crescent mine, foreman. 14 months ago there was a collapse in the lower shaft." She looked at the cup. "They gave me 30 days to leave the company house." 30 days. It's standard. She said it flat. No bitterness, which meant the bitterness had been processed so long ago it had become something else. Just the shape of how things were. "I had some money saved. Not enough. We came north because my husband's brother has a logging operation at North Fork. His wife wrote me, said there was room and work." "You were going to make it in one run?" Colorado to North Fork? I was making it fine until the axle. James looked at her. I know how it looks, she said. It looks like a woman doing the best she could with what she had. She glanced up, like she'd expected something else from him, and was recalibrating. Thomas said, Mr. Harlow. James looked at him. We stopped in Coldwater Creek first, before the road. He said it carefully. To ask about shelter. With the storm coming. He looked at the table. We knocked on 4 doors. Nobody answered. One woman looked through her window and pulled the curtain. Margaret said, Thomas, he should know, Thomas said. He looked at James directly. I'm not telling it to complain. I'm telling it so you understand that what you did tonight, it wasn't something everybody does. The kitchen was very quiet. No, James said. I don't suppose it is. Thomas nodded once, slow, storing it away. Margaret was looking at her coffee. James stood. Storm runs 2, maybe 3 days. You're here until it passes. There's work if you want it. Chickens twice a day, wood hauled in. I cook badly enough that anything you produce will be an improvement. He looked at her steadily. We're not keeping score. You needed shelter, and I have it. That's the whole of it. That's not nothing, she said quietly. What you're doing. A woman and 2 children in a blizzard. He picked up his cup. Wasn't going to leave you out there, Mrs. Cole. Wasn't even a decision. It just was. He went to check the horses. He was halfway across the yard, head down in the wind, when he heard the barn door open behind him. Thomas. The boy pulled the door shut against the gust and stood in the relative quiet of the barn with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on Buck. Captain, apparently, for reasons James had already decided not to fight. You didn't have to come outside, James said. I know. Thomas came and stood beside him at the stall. I wanted to ask you something. Ask. The boy was quiet a moment, working up to it. My mother's not going to say this. She doesn't say things like this. But she was scared tonight, before you came. He looked at the horse. I've seen her scared before, when my father died, when we lost the house. But tonight was different. Eliza wasn't waking up right, and the storm was coming, and she kept digging. Like if she stopped digging, she'd have to think about what happened if she didn't find help. His throat moved. I've never seen her dig like that. James stood with that for a moment. She found help, he said. Yeah. Thomas's voice was rough at the edges. She did. He looked up at James. I wanted to say thank you. Myself. Not because Mama told me to. Because I wanted to. James looked at this 12-year-old boy who had been holding a lantern in a blizzard and keeping himself together so his mother wouldn't have to watch him fall apart. And he thought about what that cost a child and how long it took to pay it back. You held that family together out on that road, James said. That lantern. Staying calm. That was you. Thomas shook his head. That was Mama. I was just holding the lamp. Sometimes holding the lamp is everything. Thomas was quiet. Then something shifted in his face. Not quite breaking, but bending. A 12-year-old, showing through the years the last 14 months had put on him. She cried once, he said. After Papa's funeral. One time, in the kitchen, when she thought I was asleep. I heard her through the wall. He pressed his lips together. She stopped after maybe 2 minutes, and I heard her wash her face, and then she came to check on us like nothing happened. He looked at the ground. She's been holding it since then. All of it. 14 months. James said nothing. There was nothing to say to that would make it smaller or larger than it already was. She deserves somewhere safe, Thomas said. That's all I want, just somewhere she doesn't have to be scared. Yeah, James said. She does. Thomas looked at him. Looked at him the way a child looks when they're deciding whether to believe something. Then he nodded, pulled his coat tighter, went back to the house. James stood in the barn alone, with the storm working at the walls and Buck shifting in his stall, and he let the boys' words settle where they settled, and did not move for a long time. When he came back inside, the kitchen was empty. The lamp was turned low. A plate had been left on the stove, biscuits made from his flour, with the dried venison he'd had on the shelf, shaped into something that resembled actual food. A folded piece of paper sat beside the plate. He opened it. "Mr. Harlow, I found your flour and your stores. I hope you don't mind. It seemed more useful than leaving them on the shelf. The children are asleep. Thank you for the room. Mr. Cole." He stood at the stove and ate the biscuits standing up. They were the best thing he had eaten in longer than he wanted to calculate. He turned the lamp off and went down the hall to his room. He lay down in the dark. The storm hammered the north wall. Somewhere in the back bedroom, Eliza was talking in her sleep, low and continuous, and not quite words. The sound of a child whose mind keeps moving, even when her body finally stopped. James lay in the dark and listened. In 4 years, this house had never sounded like this. He had filled it with work and silence, and the creak of timber, and the wind that found every gap it could. None of it had touched the quiet underneath. This did. He didn't name what that meant. He wasn't ready to name it. But he lay there in the dark and listened to a child's voice moving through his house, like something that had always belonged there. And he did not sleep for a very long time. And in the kitchen, where the stove was still warm and the lamp was cold, a woman sat back down at the table in the dark and let herself cry for exactly 2 minutes. Nobody heard her. That was how she needed it. When she was done, she washed her face at the basin. She went to check on her children. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom and watched them breathe. Then she looked down the dark hallway at the closed door at the end of it. The room James Harlow had opened tonight for the first time in 4 years, and had never explained why it had been closed. And she thought, "This man is carrying something I don't know the shape of yet." She thought, "So am I." She went to bed. Outside, 4 miles east, the town of Coldwater Creek settled into its storm night quiet. Doors locked, fires banked, curtains drawn against the dark and the cold and whatever was out there in it. Nobody asked about the overturned wagon on the South Road. Nobody needed to ask. By morning, 3 people already knew. The storm kept them for 3 days. That was how James thought about it afterward. Not that the Coles stayed 3 days, but that the storm kept them, the way weather in Montana keeps people, without asking permission and without apology. The land made those decisions. People just lived inside them. The first morning, Eliza woke up hungry. Not just hungry, ferociously, specifically hungry, in the way of a child whose body has burned through everything it had, just surviving, and is now demanding repayment with interest. She appeared in the kitchen doorway at first light, wrapped in a blanket that dragged the floor behind her, and announced that she wanted eggs. James was at the stove. He looked at her. She looked at him with the clear, direct gaze of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to be uncertain about what she wants. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning. Do you have eggs?" "I do." "Can I have some?" "You can." She came in and climbed into the chair by the stove, Caroline's chair, which she had apparently decided was her chair now, and arranged her blanket around herself with great seriousness. "Mama says I have to say please." "Your mama's right." "Please." "Thank you." He cracked 2 eggs into the pan. "How are you feeling?" "My feet were cold in the night." She considered this. "But they're better now." She looked around the kitchen with the thorough, unguarded curiosity of someone cataloging a new place. Her eyes stopped on the shelf above the window. What's that? James glanced up. On the shelf sat a small carved wooden bird, a bluebird, roughed out of pine, the kind of thing a man makes in winter evenings when his hands need something to do. Caroline had asked him to make it in their second year. He had forgotten it was there. He had stopped seeing it the way you stop seeing things that are always present. A bird, he said. I know it's a bird. Who made it? I did. Eliza tilted her head. For who? James was quiet for a moment. He slid the eggs onto a plate. He set it in front of her. For someone who liked birds. She looked at him with the patient, waiting expression of a child who knows there is more to a sentence than what was said, and is willing to sit with the gap until it gets filled. He didn't fill it. She picked up her fork. Captain was happy this morning, she said, shifting without ceremony. Thomas went and checked on him before breakfast. He said he ate all his hay. That's good. Thomas worries about things. She ate a bite of egg. He's been doing it since Papa died. Checking everything. Making sure. She said it without sadness. Just fact. The way children state the shape of their world. Mama says he'll grow out of it when he feels safe enough. James kept his back to her, washing the pan. Has he felt safe? He asked. Since your father? Eliza thought about this with the full seriousness she apparently gave all questions. Sometimes, she said, but not for very long in one place. She looked at her eggs. This feels safe. James set the pan down. I'm glad, he said. Margaret appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, and she was fully dressed and her hair was pinned, and she had the look of a woman who had decided some time before dawn that whatever this situation was, she was going to meet it on her feet. She saw the plate in front of Eliza and looked at James. She asked, he said. She always asks. Margaret came in and poured herself coffee without being invited to, which James took as a good sign, that she'd stopped performing the guest formality and was simply existing in the space. She asked the landlord's wife in Pueblo for his dog. Did she get it? No, but she had a plan that was genuinely difficult to argue with. She sat down. Thank you for feeding her. She said please. He leaned against the counter. Thomas is at the barn. I know. He was up before me. She wrapped her hands around her cup. The bandages from last night, slightly loosened now. He does that in new places. Gets up early, goes and checks on things. Makes sure we haven't lost something else in the night. It was the second time he'd heard that about the boy in 12 hours. He thought about saying something and decided against it. Some things landed better when you let them sit. Storm's holding, he said instead. Probably through tonight, maybe tomorrow morning. She nodded. She looked at the window. I need to send word to North Fork. My sister-in-law will be expecting us. There's a man in town, Perkins, runs the dry goods. His boy does courier runs between here and the Fork when the road's passable. Day after the storm breaks, he can take a letter. That'll work, she paused. Thank you. You keep thanking me. You keep doing things worth thanking. He looked at her. She looked back at him steadily, not challenging, not soft, just direct. It was a quality he was starting to recognize as simply the way she operated. No performance, no management, just the thing itself, stated plainly. Thomas came in from the barn with cold on his coat, and the businesslike expression of someone who has completed an inspection and found results satisfactory. He nodded at James. He sat down. He accepted a plate without comment. They ate together, all four of them, at the table that had held only James for 4 years. Nobody remarked on it. It happened the way natural things happen, without announcement. The first word came from town that afternoon. Ruth Hensley drove her wagon up the road through 8 inches of new snow, with the determination of a woman who has decided weather is a suggestion. She was 63 years old and had lived 2 miles south of James Harlow for 11 years and had brought food after Caroline died and had never once said anything that wasn't worth saying. Which was why James trusted her, in the general way you trust someone whose actions have proven reliable over time. She came through the door with a covered dish and snow on her boots, and her eyes already doing the particular work of someone who is gathering information while appearing to simply arrive. She saw Margaret first, then Thomas, then Eliza, who waved from the stove chair. "Ruth Hensley," James said. "Mrs. Cole and her children. Their wagon went over in the storm on the South Road. They're here until the road clears." Ruth set the dish on the table. She looked at Margaret with the assessing directness of a woman who has also lived a hard life and is looking to see what kind of woman she's looking at. Margaret looked back the same way. Something passed between them that James couldn't fully read. The specific language of women who have been tested and are checking whether the person across from them has also been tested and how they came through it. "You warm enough?" Ruth asked. "Yes, thank you." "Children eating?" "Yes." Ruth pulled out the chair across from Margaret and sat down. "Good. I brought venison stew. James's cooking is a moral failing." She glanced at him. "Sit down, James. I'm not talking to the back of your head." He sat. Ruth poured herself coffee like it was her own kitchen. "Where were you headed?" "North Fork," Margaret said. "My husband's family." "Husband traveling separately?" "My husband passed 14 months ago." Ruth was quiet for exactly one beat, not the prolonged, laden silence of someone performing sympathy, just a beat of acknowledgement. "I'm sorry," she said. "That's a long road for one person." "I managed." "I can see that." Ruth looked at the kitchen, the clean counter, the organized shelf, the stove properly fed. "You've been here one night, and this kitchen already looks more alive than it has in years." She looked at James without apology. "I'm stating a fact." James said nothing. "People in town know," Ruth said. She set down her cup. She said it the way you say something that needs saying before it becomes harder to say. "Haggerty's boy was on the South Road yesterday afternoon, before the storm closed. He saw the wagon. He saw you bringing them up the drive." She looked at James directly. "By this morning there were 4 versions of the story, none of them flattering." Margaret's hands were still on the table. "What kind of versions?" James asked. "The kind people tell when they need a story to be something more interesting than a man helping people in a blizzard." Ruth looked at her stew. "Victor Strand was in the feed store this morning. He had opinions." Thomas had gone still across the table. He was listening with a focused, recording attention James had come to recognize as the boy's particular way of processing threat. Not panic, not reaction, just careful intake and storage. "Victor Strand," James said, "has opinions about everything that isn't his business." "He does, and he has a habit of making other people's business into his." Ruth looked at Margaret. "He runs the bank. He runs half the businesses in Coldwater Creek through notes and credit and the patience of a man who is very comfortable waiting for people to need him." She paused. "He's been wanting the grazing rights on James's North Field for 3 years." Margaret looked at James. James looked at his coffee. "He came to see me last spring," James said. "Made an offer. I said no." He was quiet a moment. "He said the offer stood. That was all." "That was all until now," Ruth said. "Now he has something to point at." She leaned back. "I'm not telling you this to frighten anyone. I'm telling you because you should know what's in the room before you walk into it." "I appreciate that," James said. Ruth looked at him steadily. "You did right bringing them in. I want to be clear about that. What you did was right. But right doesn't make a thing easy, and easy is what Strand deals in. She picked up her spoon. He's going to find the most comfortable way to make this as difficult as possible for you. Let him try. Ruth looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Margaret. You're going to need to be prepared. People are going to look at you in ways you haven't earned, and say things about this arrangement that aren't true. And some of the women who look at you the worst will be the ones who are most frightened. Margaret met her eyes. Frightened of what? Of you. Ruth said it plainly. A woman alone who keeps moving and keeps standing and keeps asking for nothing but work, that frightens women who have built their whole lives on not having to do those things. It makes them feel like the wrong kind of woman showed up. She paused. That's their problem, not yours. But it lands on you. That's the part that's not fair. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face. Not the composed, managed surface, but something underneath it, briefly visible. Then she said, I've been frightened plenty, Mrs. Hensley. I've just learned not to let it steer. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once, with the specific nod of a person who has just confirmed something they suspected. Good, she said. That's good. Eliza, who had been listening to all of this with the wide, unblinking attention of a 7-year-old, said, What's a grazing right? Ruth blinked. Then she laughed, a short, surprised sound. It's what men fight about instead of fighting about what they're actually fighting about, she said. Eliza considered this. That's silly. Yes, Ruth said. It is. After Ruth left, the house held the particular quiet that follows the departure of someone who has said necessary things. James washed the dishes. Thomas split the afternoon's wood without being asked. Margaret sat at the table, writing her letter to North Fork, and Eliza sat beside her, drawing something on the back of an old feed list with a piece of charcoal she had found and been given permission to use. At some point, Thomas came back in and stood at the kitchen doorway and said, Mr. Harlow. James looked at him. The man she mentioned, Strand. Thomas kept his voice level. He's going to try to use us against you. That's his intention. Thomas looked at the floor, then at James. We could go to town, stay at the boarding house until the road to North Fork opens, take it off you. James turned from the sink. He looked at the boy fully. You knocked on 4 doors in Coldwater Creek before the storm, he said. Nobody answered. Thomas's jaw tightened. We'd figure it out. In 6 inches of new snow, with no money for a boarding house. He kept his voice even. You'd figure it out the same way you figured it out on that road, by holding the lamp and not letting anyone see what it's costing you. Thomas said nothing. You're staying here, James said. That's not charity, that's sense. And it's what's right. I don't make decisions based on what Victor Strand thinks about them. What if he makes it bad for you? Then it gets bad for me. James looked at the boy. That's not your weight to carry, Thomas. You've been carrying other people's weight since you were 10 years old. Put it down. Thomas swallowed. It's not that simple. No, it's not. But it's what I'm asking. The boy stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he looked at his mother's back, bent over her letter, pen moving, shoulders carrying the particular straightness of a woman who has decided how she will hold herself through this, and is holding it. And then he looked back at James. She won't say it, Thomas said quietly. But she's glad we're here. Not just because of the shelter. He stopped. She laughed this morning. When Eliza said the horse's name was Captain, she actually laughed. He said it like it was remarkable, like it had been a long time since it wasn't. James was quiet. She needs that, Thomas said. She needs... He stopped again, pressed his lips together. She needs somewhere she doesn't have to be afraid of the next thing, just for a little while. Then that's what this is. Thomas held his eyes, weighing it. Then he nodded. That slow, deliberate nod of his, the one that meant something was being filed away. He went to help with the horses. Margaret looked up from her letter after the door closed. She hadn't appeared to be listening, but she had been. She looked at James across the kitchen. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. There wasn't anything to say that the moment hadn't already said more cleanly than words would. She looked back at her letter. James went back to the sink. That night, after the children were in bed, he sat alone at the table for a while with the lamp between him and the window and the storm finally starting to ease. The wind pulling back, the pressure lifting. The particular silence that follows the worst of a thing once it has passed. He sat with the image of Ruth's face when she said Strand's name, and the image of Thomas standing at the barn door, asking if they could leave to protect him, and the image of Margaret's shoulders and the way she had laughed that morning over the horse's name. He thought about Strand. He'd known Victor Strand for 11 years, which was long enough to understand exactly what kind of man he was. The kind whose power is not in his fists, but in his patience, in his ledgers, in his precise and quiet understanding of what every person in 30 miles owed, and exactly where to press to make that debt felt. Strand had never needed to raise his voice. Men with his kind of power never did. They just waited, and adjusted, and pressed. James knew what was coming. He had known it since Ruth said the name. What he hadn't known, what he was only now beginning to understand, was that he wasn't going to move. He had brought these people in off a road where a child was dying, and they were warm and fed and safe, and that was not going to change because Victor Strand had opinions. He would deal with what came from that. He had dealt with harder things. He blew the lamp out and sat in the dark for a moment, and in the back bedroom, he could hear Eliza talking in her sleep again, that low, running murmur that had moved through the house every night she'd been here, threading itself through the walls and the quiet, like something that had decided this was where it belonged. He sat in the dark and listened. Outside, 2 miles south, Ruth Hensley was sitting at her own table, writing a letter of her own to her niece in Helena. And what she wrote was this: James Harlow did the right thing. I expect he'll pay for it. I expect he'll pay without complaint. The woman is something I haven't seen in a while and can't quite name yet. Her boy is 10 years older than he is. Her little girl named his horse. I don't know what this is going to become, but I know what it already is, and it's worth protecting. She sealed the letter. She put it on the stack to send when the road cleared. In town, 4 miles east, Victor Strand sat at the desk in his office above the bank and looked at a piece of paper that had 11 blank lines on it, and thought about which names he was going to put on those lines and how long it was going to take to fill them. He was a patient man. He had time. The road to North Fork opened on a Thursday. James knew it before anyone told him because the light changed. The flat, white compression of storm light lifting into something sharper. The sky going from pressed-down gray to the particular hard blue of a Montana winter that has said what it had to say and moved on. The creek ice caught the morning sun and threw it back. Buck was restless in the stall. The land had that quality of a held breath finally released. He stood at the kitchen window with his coffee and looked at it, and did not say anything for a long time. Margaret was at the stove. She had been at the stove every morning for 6 days, which was how long the storm and its aftermath had kept them. 6 days of eggs and biscuits and the venison stews she'd made from his stores, and the bread she'd figured out how to produce from his flour and his sorry collection of pans. 6 days of Thomas at the woodpile, and Eliza conducting ongoing negotiations with Captain through the fence rails. and the four of them at the table 3 times a day, like it was a thing they had always done. He had stopped noticing how full the house was, which meant he had started to accept it, which was the thing he had been careful not to do. "Road's clear," he said. Margaret didn't turn from the stove. "I know." A beat of silence. "Perkins can have you to North Fork by nightfall if you leave by mid-morning." He looked at his coffee. "I can hitch the spare wagon. The coal wagon's axle needs a blacksmith before it's roadworthy, but the spare will hold." "James." She said his name the way she'd started saying it somewhere in the middle of the second day. Without the formality, just the name, direct. She turned from the stove. She looked at him. "I know what the road means." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to say something you're not ready to say," she said. "I'm not asking you for anything, but I want to be honest with you, the way you've been honest with me." She set the pan down. 6 days ago, I was digging my daughter out of a drift with my bare hands. You came off that road, and you brought us in, and you didn't make us feel like a problem to be managed. You don't know what that is. You can't know what that is, to a person who has been nothing but a problem to be managed for 14 months. James held her gaze. "I'm grateful," she said. "That's all. I wanted to say it plainly before we go." "You've worked every day you've been here," he said, "twice over. That's not why I'm grateful." She held his eyes. "You know that." He did know it. That was the difficulty. Thomas appeared in the doorway from the hall, with the timing of a child who has learned to read rooms and enter them at the right moment. He looked at his mother, then at James, then at the window and the changed light. "The road?" he said. "Clear," James said. Thomas nodded. Something moved across his face. Not disappointment, or not only disappointment. Something more complicated. The expression of a person who has been somewhere long enough to feel the leaving. "I'll pack the trunk," he said. "Thomas," Margaret started. "I'll pack the trunk, Mama." He said it gently. "We knew the road was going to open." He went back down the hall. Eliza took the news differently. She received it at the breakfast table, with the stillness of a child absorbing something that doesn't fit the shape of what she wants. And then she looked at James with the direct, unmanaged gaze that had been her particular way since the first morning. "Do we have to?" she said. "You've got family waiting in North Fork," James said. "I know, but Captain is here." "Captain is Buck," James said, which was the position he had maintained for 6 days without any success. "And he'll be fine." Eliza looked at the horse through the window. She looked back at James. "He'll miss me." "He will," James agreed. She looked at her eggs. She ate them with the focused, private sorrow of a 7-year-old processing loss and not wanting anyone to see. Then she put her fork down and said, "Will you come visit? At North Fork?" James looked at her. "It's a full day's ride." "I know how far it is." She looked at him steadily. "Will you come?" He was quiet for a moment. "If you need something." "Yes." She looked at him for a long time with those serious brown eyes. Then she said, "Okay," and picked her fork back up, which meant she had decided to accept the terms even if she wasn't fully satisfied with them. They left at 9:30. James hitched the spare wagon himself and loaded the small trunk and the canvas and the provisions Margaret had asked him to let her pay for, which he had agreed to for the same reason he'd agreed to the work arrangement at the start. Because she needed it to be a transaction and not a gift, and he understood that, and he respected it. Thomas shook his hand at the gate. Firm grip, eye contact. The handshake of a boy performing the ritual of a man and meaning every part of it. "Thank you," Thomas said, "for what you said, about putting the weight down." "You remember that," James said. "Yes, sir." Eliza hugged him. She simply walked up and put her arms around him without announcement or permission and pressed her face into his coat and held on for a full 5 seconds. Then she let go and climbed up onto the wagon seat like nothing had happened. James stood at the gate. Margaret looked at him from the wagon seat. She had her hands wrapped around the reins and her back straight and her face composed. And she was looking at him the way she had looked at him on the road that first night. That measuring, careful look of a woman who does not take things at face value and is trying to see something true. "You're a good man, James Harlow," she said. Not soft, just fact. He tipped his hat. She turned the wagon and drove it up the road toward Coldwater Creek. And Thomas sat beside her, and Eliza sat on Thomas's other side. And James watched them until the wagon turned at the bend and the road was empty. He stood at the gate for a moment. Then he went back inside. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been in 6 days. He washed the breakfast dishes. He went out and checked the horses. He came back in and sat at the table and looked at the kitchen and noticed that she had left everything in order. The stove clean, the flour put back. The pans hung where she'd found them. She had left the carved wooden bird on the shelf exactly where it was. He sat at the table for a long time. Victor Strand came to see him the following Tuesday. James was splitting wood when he heard the horse on the drive, and he finished the log he was working on before he stopped and turned. Because he had been expecting this visit for a week, and he had decided before it arrived that he was going to meet it on his own terms. Strand dismounted with the unhurried ease of a man who has never needed to rush, because the thing he wants has always been willing to wait for him. He was 55, well-built, with the careful, pleasant face of a man who has learned that looking reasonable is more effective than looking powerful. His coat was good wool. His boots were clean, despite the snow. He looked at the woodpile, then at James, then at the house. "James," he said. "Victor, I heard your guests moved on." "They did." "Good." Strand's voice was warm, practiced. "Glad they found their way. Terrible thing, a family caught out in a storm like that." He paused. "You did a charitable thing, bringing them in." "I did the necessary thing," James said. "There's a difference." Strand smiled. "Of course." He looked at the house again. "I wanted to come in person, as a neighbor, as someone who has always had respect for your family." He let that sit for a moment. "People in town have been talking." People in town always talk. They do. But this particular talk has some weight behind it. Some of the families, the Prescotts, the Aldermans, the Deacons, they came to me. As a community leader, he said it without irony. They're concerned about precedent. What precedent is that? A man of your standing taking in a woman of unknown character, alone, for nearly a week. Strand's voice stayed pleasant, the way a blade stays still before it moves. These are families with children, James. They worry about the examples set. James set the axe down. He looked at Strand directly. "The example I set," he said, "is that when a child is dying in a snowbank 4 miles from town, and every door in that town is closed, one person doesn't close his." He paused. "I want to help you through this quietly, before it becomes something that doesn't stay quiet." "My offer on the North Field still stands," James said. Strand blinked. "That's what this is, Victor." James looked at him steadily. "The Prescotts and the Aldermans and the Deacons didn't come to you because they're worried about their children. They came to you because you went to them first." He picked up the axe. "My answer on the North Field is the same as it was in the spring. It's not for sale." Strand's pleasant expression stayed on his face, the way a coat stays on a hook. Hung there, not alive. "I hope you'll reconsider," he said, "before things get complicated." James looked at him. "Already thought about it," James said. "Come down off that horse, and I'll split wood with you, and we can talk about something real. Otherwise, you can ride back to town and do whatever it is you've decided to do, and I'll handle it when it arrives." Strand looked down at him from the horse. James looked back. Strand turned the horse and rode up the drive without another word. James split 4 more logs before he went inside. He needed to do something with his hands. He always needed that. Ruth Hensley drove up the road the next morning before James had finished his first cup of coffee. She came in without knocking, which was her habit. "Says your arrangement with the coal woman was an indecency and a public embarrassment, and that the community requires an investigation." Ruth was quiet for. "If she knows, she'll try to leave. She'll think she's protecting me." "Maybe." Ruth held his gaze. "Or maybe she's exactly the kind of woman who doesn't leave when it gets hard. Maybe you've been alone long enough that you've forgotten those women exist." She paused. "Caroline was one, in case you've forgotten." The name landed the way it always did, like a hand placed flat on a bruise. Not cruel, just present. "I haven't forgotten," he said. "Then ride to North Fork," Ruth said. "Tell her what's happening. Let her make her own decision." She stood. "That's all I'm saying. Let her decide. Don't decide for her that she can't handle it." After Ruth left, James stood in the kitchen for a long time. He looked at the chair by the stove, the one that had been Caroline's, and then for 6 days had been Eliza's, and was now just a chair again, which was worse somehow than either of the other things. He looked at the shelf where the carved wooden bird sat. He looked at it for the first time in 4 years. Really looked at it, not around it. Bluebird, pine. Rough at the wingtips because he'd been learning when he made it and hadn't gotten the fineness right. Caroline had said, "I love it exactly as it is. Don't fix it." He had been going to fix it anyway, and then she died, and he never did. He put his coat on. He saddled Buck. He rode the 4 miles into Coldwater Creek and stopped at the telegraph office on Main Street, and he wrote the message himself, standing at the counter with the pen in his hand and the operator watching with a careful, neutral expression of a man paid to send messages and not read them. The message said, "Mrs. Cole, something has come up that concerns you and your children. I would not ask you to make the ride in winter if it wasn't necessary. I believe it is necessary. I believe you should know what is happening here before it gets further along. I will explain everything when I see you. Please come when you are able. J. Harlow." He paid for the message. He walked back out onto the main street of Coldwater Creek and stood in the cold and looked up and down it. He had lived 4 miles from this town for 11 years. He had bought his supplies here, banked here, sat at the back of the church twice a year here. He knew these buildings and most of the people in them, and the rough shape of how they each worked. He saw Edna Prescott come out of the dry goods and look at him, and look away. He saw Harold Deacon crossing the street on the far side, who had been his neighbor for a decade and had come to Caroline's burial and stood at the back and not said much, but had stood there, and who now crossed the street before the paths could intersect. He saw, in the window of the bank above Main Street, the shape of a man standing at the glass looking down. James looked up at that window for a moment. Then he tipped his hat at no one in particular and walked back to Buck and rode home. That night he sat at the table alone and wrote a letter to a lawyer in Helena that Ruth had mentioned, a woman's rights attorney who had handled 2 property cases in the territory and won both. He didn't know if it would come to that. He didn't know what was going to happen when Margaret came, or if she would come, or what she would decide when she knew everything. He wrote the letter anyway, because having it ready was better than not having it. Because the storm had already declared itself, and now it was only a matter of how you stood inside it. He sealed the letter. He set it on the shelf beside the carved wooden bird. He looked at the bird for a long moment. Then he turned the lamp down and sat in the dark and listened to the wind working at the north wall, and thought about a woman on a wagon seat with her back straight and her hands steady on the reins, driving away up a road she hadn't chosen, toward a life that kept requiring more from her than any life should. He thought, "Come back." He didn't say it out loud. He sat in the dark and thought it anyway. Margaret arrived on a Friday. James was at the north fence when he heard the wagon on the drive, and he knew before he turned around because there was only one person he had sent for, and only one person he had been listening for across 4 days of silence since the telegraph went out. He set down the post driver. He walked back toward the house without hurrying, because hurrying would mean something he wasn't ready to put a name to yet. She had Thomas with her. She had left Eliza with her sister-in-law in North Fork, which told him everything about what kind of woman she was. That she had read the urgency in his message correctly, had understood this was not a thing to bring a 7-year-old into, and had made the hard decision without anyone asking her to. She was down from the wagon before he reached the gate. Her face had the same quality it had on the road the night of the storm, that clear, assessing directness, that absence of pretense. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Thomas tied the horse. He nodded at James and went straight to the barn, which was his way of giving them the space he understood they needed. "Come inside," James said. She came inside. He told her everything. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and laid it out in order. Strand's visit, the 6 names, the morality clause, the county commissioner, the hearing that would be required if Strand reached 10 signatures. He told it the way he told everything that mattered, without softening and without performance, because she had earned the plain truth, and he was not going to insult her with a managed version of it. She listened without interrupting. Her hands were folded on the table. Her face was still. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How many names does he have now?" "Ruth thinks 8, maybe 9. "When did Ruth think 9? "2 days ago." Margaret looked at the table. "So possibly 10 by now." "Possibly." She was quiet again. He watched her process it, not with panic, not with the collapse he had half expected and half feared, but with the specific, focused stillness of a person running calculations, assessing, deciding. "This is because of me," she said. "This is because of Strand's greed and the cowardice of people who signed their names to something they knew wasn't true," James said. "You didn't cause that. I'm the reason he has an angle. You're the reason he manufactured one. That's different." She looked up at him. "James." "It's different," he said again, "and you know it." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "What does the lawyer in Helena say?" "I haven't heard back yet. Sent the letter 4 days ago." He looked at his coffee. "But Ruth knows someone else. A man named Aldrich in Billings, who has handled property cases under the morality statute before. He says the statute requires documented harm. Rumor and opinion aren't sufficient. Strand needs witnesses willing to testify to actual wrongdoing." "And does he have those?" "He has people willing to say what he tells them to say." James was quiet for a moment. "But there's a difference between people willing to say something in private and people willing to stand up in a public hearing and say it in front of the whole county. Some of those 8 or 9 names are going to look at that room and reconsider." Margaret looked at her hands. "Or they won't." "Or they won't," he agreed. "I'm not going to tell you it's certain." "No." She almost smiled. Not humor, just acknowledgement. "You wouldn't tell me that." Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had the look of a boy who has been thinking hard for 4 days and has arrived at the conclusion he intends to present. "Mr. Harlow." James looked at him. "I want to be at the hearing." He said it plainly. "If there is one, I want to be there." "Thomas," Margaret started. "I'm 12 years old, and I was in that wagon, and I was on that road, and I know what happened." He looked at his mother, then at James. "If they're going to say things about my mother in front of the whole county, I want to be in that room." Margaret looked at her son for a long moment. James watched her do the thing he had seen her do before. The rapid internal calculation, the mother's equation of protection versus truth, the question of what a child can handle versus what a child has already been handling without anyone asking. "You'll sit still," she said finally. "You won't react, whatever they say." "Yes, ma'am." "Not because you're afraid of them. Because your stillness will say more than anything you could say out loud." Thomas nodded. He understood that. The hearing was set for the following Thursday, which gave them 6 days. Ruth Hensley drove up the next morning with pie and information, in that order. And the information was that Strand had his 10 names. The hearing was confirmed. The county commissioner, a man named Graves from Billings, not Strand's man, which was the first piece of genuinely good news, would preside. "Graves is fair," Ruth said. "I don't know if he's brave, but he's fair. There's a difference, and right now I'll take fair." "Who are the 10?" James asked. Ruth named them. James knew most of them, people he had bought from and sold to and nodded at in church for a decade. He listened to each name with a particular feeling of something that has been abstract becoming concrete, the way a winter storm is abstract on the horizon and specific when it's against your walls. Margaret listened without expression. When Ruth finished, Margaret said, "Nora Strand is on the list." "Yes." "Victor's wife signed her own husband's petition." "She did." Margaret was quiet. Then she said, "She was afraid not to." Ruth looked at her. "Most of them were." "That's not an excuse," Margaret looked at the table. "But it's a reason, and reasons matter if you want to understand a thing rather than just be angry at it." She paused. "I've been angry at things for 14 months. It doesn't change them." Ruth looked at her for a long moment with the expression she had worn the first morning, that assessing look, recalibrating. Then she said, "You're going to be all right." "I know," Margaret said. "I just need to get through Thursday first." The days between the decision and the hearing moved the way bad time always moves. Too slowly when you were inside it, and too fast when you looked back. James worked. Margaret cooked and cleaned and helped with the horses, and did not talk about Thursday more than necessary, which was itself a kind of courage, the discipline of not letting the anticipated thing consume the present one. Thomas split wood every morning until there was more wood stacked against the north wall than they would use in 2 winters. He didn't say much about it. His hands needed something, and the wood was there. On the Wednesday evening before the hearing, Reverend Samuel Hayes rode up the drive in the last of the cold afternoon light. He was a lean, serious man, with the deliberate movements of someone who has decided that unhurried things carry more weight. He came in and sat down and drank the coffee Margaret put in front of him, and looked at James with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of a man who has already decided where he stands, and is here to say so. "I want you to know," he said, "what I intend to say tomorrow." James looked at him. "I have been pastor of Coldwater Creek for 9 years. In those 9 years I have watched this man work his land alone, and deal fairly with everyone who dealt with him. I have watched him bury his wife." Hayes looked at his coffee. "And I have watched, over the past 3 weeks, a man of genuine decency be accused of indecency by people who would have let a woman and 2 children freeze to death on a road, rather than risk an inconvenient conversation with their neighbors. He looked up. I will say that. Tomorrow, in front of whoever is in that room. They'll pressure you, James said. Strand has the banknote on the church building. I know he does. Hayes was quiet for a moment. I've thought about that carefully. I've decided that a church whose pastor stays silent about injustice to protect its mortgage is no longer a church in any sense that matters. He set down his cup. So, I'll say what I came to say. Margaret was at the sink. She had her back to the room and her hands in the washwater, and she had gone very still. Thank you, James said. Hayes stood. He looked at Margaret's back. Mrs. Cole. She turned. I'm sorry for the weeks you've spent here carrying something you shouldn't have had to carry. He said it simply, without ceremony. That was this town's failure, not yours. Margaret held his gaze. Something moved through her face. Brief, real, the managed composure loosening just at the edges. Thank you, Reverend, she said. He nodded. He put on his hat. He let himself out. After he was gone, Thomas said from the doorway, That was real. The kind where they look at the floor. Margaret turned to look at her son. That's how I can tell, he said. Real sorry looks at the floor. Performed sorry looks at you, so you can see them being sorry. James looked at the boy. Then he looked at Margaret. She was looking at Thomas with the expression of a woman who has watched her child become something remarkable, and is only now, in a quiet kitchen on the eve of something hard, allowing herself to see it fully. Go to bed, she said quietly. Both of you need sleep. Thomas went. James stayed at the table. Margaret came and sat across from him. She looked at her hands on the table, healed now, the cracks closed, the bandages long gone. She turned them over once, looking at the palms. I'm frightened, she said. She said it the way she said hard things, plainly, without asking for anything in response, just stating the true thing because it was true. I know, James said. Not for me. She looked up. For you. For what you've put on the line. She held his gaze. You had a life here. 11 years. Your land, your neighbors, your standing. And you're going to walk into a room tomorrow and defend something that was simply the right thing to do, and it may cost you half of what you've built. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not entirely. That's because of me. Whatever you say about Strand and the field, the reason that room exists is because of me. The reason that room exists, James said, is that a child was dying on a road and the right thing was obvious, and I did it. And if doing the right thing costs me something, then the cost tells me more about the town than it tells me about the decision. She looked at him. I would do it again, he said. Tomorrow morning. Same road, same storm, same choice. He held her eyes. That hasn't moved, Margaret. Not once. The sound of her name in his voice, not Mrs. Cole, not ma'am, just her name, said the way you say the name of a person who has become real to you, landed between them with the weight of everything they had been building since a Montana road in a blizzard. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at the table. I left my husband's brother's house, she said quietly. When your message came, I read it and I told my sister-in-law I was going back. She asked me why. A pause. I told her it was because you needed to tell me something important. She said that wasn't the whole reason. She looked up. She was right. James was still. I came back because I wanted to, Margaret said. Not just because you needed to tell me something. Because when I drove away up that road, I kept looking back at your gate and thinking, She stopped, started again. I kept thinking about the chair by the stove, about the bird on the shelf, about the way Thomas talked to you, and the way Eliza named your horse, and the way you sat at that table and ate those biscuits standing up, because you didn't even think to sit down. She looked at her hands. About the way this house felt. After. After? He said. After you brought us in. After the lamp was lit, and the children were warm, and the storm was outside instead of on top of us. She looked at him directly. This house felt like somewhere. Not just a building. Somewhere. She paused. I haven't felt that in a very long time. James looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight and thought about Caroline saying, "This view is going to make me believe in things," and thought about 4 years of silence that had nothing to do with sound, and thought about the way Eliza's voice had moved through the walls at night, like something that had decided it belonged there. He thought, so have I. He didn't say it. Not tonight. Tonight was for tomorrow. Get some sleep, he said. The hearing's at 9. She almost smiled. You're not going to say anything else. Not tonight. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. That small, direct nod of hers that meant she understood and was accepting the terms. She stood. She went down the hall. He sat at the table alone and listened to the house settle around him and thought about tomorrow. The hearing was held in the Coldwater Creek Town Hall, a plain, functional building that smelled like cold wood and old paper and the specific kind of civic anxiety that gathers in a room when a community is about to look at itself. James arrived with Margaret on his left and Thomas behind him, and walked through the door the way a man walks through a door he has every right to walk through, which he did, and he intended everyone in that room to understand it. The room was full. Strand sat at the front table with 2 men James didn't recognize, county officials by the look of them, and the commissioner, Graves, who was a compact, gray-haired man with the assessing eyes of someone who has presided over enough hearings to know which way a room is tilted before the first word is spoken. Strand did not look at them when they entered. That was its own statement. Ruth Hensley was in the 3rd row. She nodded at Margaret once, firm and certain, the nod of a woman who has shown up and intends to stay shown up. Reverend Hayes sat in the 2nd row. He met James's eyes and held them. James sat. Margaret sat beside him, straight-backed, hands folded in her lap, her face carrying the composed expression that James now understood was not coldness, but armor. The specific, deliberate armor of a woman who will not give a room the satisfaction of seeing her diminished by it. Thomas sat on her other side and went still in the way he had, that focused, recording stillness. Graves opened the proceedings. He was measured, precise, with the careful voice of a man who understood that the words said in this room would have weight beyond the room. He read the complaint. He named the statute. He explained the standard of evidence required. Then Strand's man spoke. He was a lawyer from Billings, smooth and prepared, who laid out the complaint in language designed to sound reasonable while meaning something that was not. He spoke about community standards and moral character and the protection of families. He did not say, Victor Strand wants this man's north field and has built a moral panic to get it. He did not say, 9 of your 10 signatories signed because they were afraid of what would happen to their credit at the bank if they didn't. He said none of those things. He was too skilled for that. When he finished, James's lawyer, Aldrich, who had ridden up from Billings the previous evening, and had the unhurried competence of a man who does not need to perform confidence because he simply has it, stood and laid out 3 things in the quiet, deliberate manner of someone who knows that precision lands harder than volume. He documented the employment arrangement. He presented the absence of any evidence beyond assertion and rumor. He cited the statute's own requirement for documented harm, and he cited 3 previous cases in the territory where similar complaints had been dismissed for insufficient evidence. He sat down. Graves called witnesses. The witnesses Strand had assembled spoke with a particular discomfort of people who have committed to a thing in private and are now being required to perform it in public, in front of the full light of a room that is watching more carefully than they expected. Harold Deacon spoke about community values. Edna Prescott spoke about her children. A man named Burrow, who owned the livery and owed Strand 2 years of back notes, said he had concerns about the example being set. When Graves asked each of them to specify what harm they had personally witnessed, each of them paused. Each of them described things that were not harm. A woman cooking in a man's kitchen, a boy hauling wood, a child sitting by a stove. Things that became something only if you had already decided they were something. James sat still through all of it. Margaret sat still. Thomas sat still. Then Graves said, "Does the respondent wish to speak?" James stood. The room shifted, not loudly, just that subtle reorientation of a crowd that has been waiting for the center of the thing to reveal itself. He looked at the room, not at Strand, at the room, at the faces of the people he had lived alongside for 11 years, the ones looking at him with satisfaction, the ones looking down, the 2 or 3 in the back rows looking at him with something that was close enough to shame that it didn't need a different name. "3 weeks ago," he said, "I found a woman and 2 children on the South Road in a blizzard. The little girl was not conscious when I reached her. Her mother had been digging through snow with bare hands for long enough that they were bleeding." He paused. Before they reached that road, they stopped in Coldwater Creek. They knocked on 4 doors. Every door was closed. Another pause. "I want the people in this room to sit with that. A child dying in the snowbank 4 miles from town, and 4 doors closed." The room was quiet. "I brought them to my ranch because the alternative was leaving them to die. I fed them and housed them for 6 days because the storm didn't care about anyone's opinion of the arrangement. I treated Mrs. Cole with the same respect I would treat any person who came to my door needing help. Her son worked every day he was there. Her daughter," he stopped briefly, "named my horse. And when the road cleared, they left." He looked at the room. "That is the entirety of what happened. That is the public danger this petition asks you to investigate." He looked at Strand for the first time. What this petition is actually about is the north field bordering Strand's grazing land, and the water rights that come with it. "Victor came to my ranch in December and told me things would get complicated if I didn't reconsider his offer. 3 weeks later, this complaint appeared." He held Strand's eyes. "I don't need a lawyer to connect those facts. Neither does anyone in this room. And neither does Commissioner Graves." Strand was on his feet. "That is a slanderous sit down, Mr. Strand." Graves's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. "Mr. Aldrich, you have documentation?" Aldrich stood. He placed 3 papers on the commissioner's table. Bank correspondence, a record of Strand's offer on the North Field, a signed statement from a county clerk in Billings documenting a request from Strand's office to have this specific hearing assigned to a commissioner known to be sympathetic to property acquisition cases, a request that had been denied, which was why Graves was sitting in that chair. The room did not erupt the way James had half expected. It went the other kind of loud, the low, rolling kind. People turning to each other, Voices underneath voices. The sound of a story being revised in real time by the people who had been living inside the wrong version of it. Strand's face had gone the color of old brick. His lawyer was leaning close, speaking low. Strand was not listening. He was looking at James with the specific expression of a man who has just understood that the thing he thought he controlled has turned around. Graves called for order. He got it. He looked at the papers Aldrich had provided. He looked at the complaint. He looked at Strand. "Mr. Strand," he said, "do you wish to respond to these documents?" Strand said, "This hearing is not about property." "No," Graves said, "it is not. It is about a complaint that does not meet the evidentiary standard required by the statute under which it was filed." He set the papers down. "The complaint is dismissed," he said it plainly, without ceremony, the way a fair man closes a thing that should not have been opened. The room went through several kinds of silence in the space of 3 seconds. First the silence of surprise, then the silence of a room exhaling, then the beginning of voices. Margaret's hand found James's arm, not clinging, just present. One brief, real contact. He felt it the way you feel something when you have been carrying a weight alone for long enough that the first moment of shared weight surprises you with how different it feels. He did not look down, but something in him shifted. Ruth Hensley, from the 3rd row, said nothing, but she sat back in her chair and closed her eyes for one moment. And when she opened them again, she looked at Margaret with the expression of a woman who has been afraid for someone and is now, finally, not. Thomas had not moved through any of it. He had sat exactly as his mother had told him to sit. Still, straight, watching everything. Now he looked at James. "You knew," he said quietly, "that he would stand up when you said the North Field. You let him talk all morning, and then you made him stand up." James looked at the boy. "Same reason you waited," Thomas said. "The room needed to see what he was before they saw what he'd done." James said nothing. Thomas nodded, slow, certain. "Okay," he said. He said it the way he said things he was storing permanently. They were among the last to leave the hall. Strand had gone quickly, without looking at them, his lawyer at his shoulder, and his face arranged into something that was trying to be dignity, and was not quite getting there. Several of the signatories filed out without meeting anyone's eyes. Edna Prescott stopped near the door, opened her mouth, closed it, and moved on. Harold Deacon stopped. He looked at James. He looked at Margaret. He said, "I'm sorry," in the voice of a man who means it and knows it isn't enough and is saying it anyway because not saying it would be worse. "Harold," James said. Deacon looked at him. "You can come by the ranch and say that again, when there's time to mean it properly." Deacon swallowed, nodded. He walked out. Ruth stopped in front of Margaret and looked at her for a moment and said nothing, which was the most Ruth thing she could have done. Because some things were past the need for words, and Ruth Hensley understood exactly when those moments were. She squeezed Margaret's arm once, firm, and walked out into the cold. They walked out into the January street together, the 3 of them, and the cold hit clean and sharp, and the sky above Coldwater Creek was the hard, clear blue of a Montana winter that has made its statement and moved on. Thomas walked close to James's side, not touching, just close, the way he had been since the morning they dug the water channel, and sat in the dry grass, and James had told him, "You're not alone in this." James looked down at him. Thomas looked up. Neither of them said anything. They walked to the wagon together, and somewhere behind them, through the thin walls of the Coldwater Creek Town Hall, the voices of a community continued. Confused, recalibrating, beginning the slow and necessary work of deciding what kind of people they were going to be now that the story they had been living inside had been replaced by the true one. They drove back to the ranch in the kind of quiet that follows the end of something hard. Not empty quiet, but the full, settling quiet of people who have been through a thing together and are still inside it, still feeling the shape of it, not yet ready to talk about what comes next. Thomas sat in the back of the wagon. He had said almost nothing since they left the town hall, which was not unusual for Thomas, except that this particular silence had a different quality to it. Not the watchful, carrying silence of a boy managing his weight. Something looser. Something that looked, from the outside, like rest. Margaret drove. James sat beside her. The road ran north through bare-limbed cottonwoods, and the creek running dark between banks of ice on either side. And the mountains sat at the horizon, doing what Montana mountains do in January, holding their watch, enormous and indifferent, and somehow, despite the indifference, comforting. Halfway home, Margaret said, "He's going to come back at you." "I know." "Not the same way. He's too careful to try the same way twice." She kept her eyes on the road. "He'll find a different angle, something smaller, something that doesn't look like what it is." "Let him find it," James said. She glanced at him. "You're not worried." "I'm not pretending I'm not worried," he said. "I'm saying that whatever he tries next, I'll handle it when it comes. Same as I handled today. Same as I've handled everything else." He looked at the road. "I'm tired of letting the anticipation of a man like Strand take up the space in my days. He gets enough of this county without getting that, too." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My sister-in-law asked me something before I left North Fork." "What did she ask?" "She asked if I was coming back because of the hearing or because of something else." She paused. "I told her about the hearing. I told her about Strand and the complaint and the 10 names. She said that wasn't what she was asking about." James looked at her. She kept her eyes forward. She said, "Helen is direct. She always has been." She said, "What is it about that ranch, Maggie? You've been here 3 weeks, and you talk about it like a place you left, rather than a place you were passing through." She turned to look at him briefly. "I didn't have an answer for her." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I needed to go back and find out." She looked at the road again. "That's the honest answer." James said nothing for a moment. Buck, captain in the minds of everyone who mattered, moved at his steady pace up the road, breathing clouds in the cold air. Thomas was quiet in the back. The ranch gate appeared at the far end of the drive, the barn behind it still wearing its fresh timber smell from the November rebuild after the previous owner's fire, which had been Strand's doing too, though that was a different story and a different winter. "Eliza asked me if I would visit," James said, "at North Fork." "I know, she told me." Margaret's mouth moved. "She said you said if they needed something." "That's what I said." "She said that wasn't good enough." James looked at the gate coming closer. She's 7, and she's been right about most things since she was 4. Margaret slowed the wagon at the gate. She looked at him. The afternoon light was going long and gold, the way January light goes, when it decides to be generous for an hour before the cold comes back. Her face in that light was tired and clear and open in the way it had been only a few times before. In the kitchen the first night. In the barn conversation she'd overheard without pretending not to hear it. At the gate, the morning she left. She asked me if Mr. Harlow was going to be her papa. The word landed. James held very still. "I told her that wasn't my answer to give," Margaret said quietly. "That it was a question for grown-ups, and it would get answered in its own time." She looked at him directly. "She said grown-ups take too long." He looked at her. The ranch behind them, the mountains beyond it, the cold air between them carrying the weight of everything that had been moving toward this moment since a road in a blizzard, and a child face down in the snow, and a man who made the only decision a man with a conscience could make. "She's not wrong," he said. Margaret held his gaze. Something moved through her face, that brief unlocking, the carefulness setting itself down. "No," she said. "She's not." They unhitched the wagon together without speaking, the way people work together when they've developed the common rhythm of a shared space and don't need words to coordinate it. Thomas took Captain to the stall and came back for the harness, and did it all with the quiet efficiency that was so much a part of him that James had stopped noticing it as remarkable and had started understanding it as simply who the boy was. Ruth Hensley arrived an hour later, as James had known she would, because Ruth had the instincts of a woman who understands that the end of a public thing is not the end of the private thing, and that people need someone to sit with them in the space after. She came in with a covered dish and sat down at the table and looked at James and Margaret with the particular expression of a woman who has been worrying about two people for weeks and has not yet fully released the worry, even though the thing that caused it is resolved. "Graves was fair," she said. "He was," James agreed. "Strand won't be done." She looked at her coffee. "You know that. Margaret said the same thing on the road." Ruth looked at Margaret. "Smart woman." "I've been told," Margaret said, without expression. Ruth almost smiled. "He'll try the water rights. He owns the eastern access to the creek tributary. He'll find something in the land deed language to dispute. It'll take a year, maybe 2. She looked at James. "Aldrich in Billings handles water rights. Same man. He's already looked at your deed. He says you're solid, but you'll want him on record. I'll write him this week." "Good." Ruth set down her cup. "The Deacons came to see me this afternoon. Harold and his wife. They want to make it right." She paused. "I told them making it right meant showing up, not just saying they would." "I told Harold the same thing," James said. "I know. He told me." Ruth looked at Margaret. "Edna Prescott is in a harder place. She's not a bad woman. She's a frightened one. And frightened women sometimes do things they spend the rest of their lives sitting with." She paused. "She'll come eventually, when she figures out how." Margaret looked at her hands on the table. "People can come when they're ready," she said. "I'm not keeping a ledger." Ruth looked at her. Then she looked at James. Then she looked at the kitchen, the clean stove, the organized shelf, the carved wooden bird in its place above the window, the chair by the stove that had been empty for 4 years and which no one had occupied this afternoon, but which no longer looked like an empty chair, just a chair with the memory of someone in it who would come back. "Good house," Ruth said quietly. She meant it the way she had the first time she said it, as more than the building. Everyone understood that. She finished her coffee. She left. Thomas went to bed early without being asked. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at James and said, "Good night," with the simple directness he used for things that mattered, and went down the hall. James heard him settle. In a few minutes the house had the breathing quality of a child asleep in it. James and Margaret sat at the table alone, the lamp between them, the window dark with the January night, the stove ticking as it cooled. "I need to go back to North Fork tomorrow," she said, "for Eliza." "I know." "She's with Helen. She's safe. But she's been there 4 days, and she's going to have strong opinions about the delay." Something moved in her voice. Not quite a laugh, but close. "She does have strong opinions," James agreed. "She gets that from her father." Margaret looked at the table. Robert was the same. Certain about things. Not arrogant, just certain. He always knew what he thought, and he said it plainly. She was quiet a moment. I love that about him. It took me a while, after he died, to understand that I could still love that about him, and also be here. She looked up. Still be a person who is present in her own life, not just someone managing what's left of his. James looked at her. I spent a year being someone managing what was left, she said. Moving through days, making sure the children ate and slept and didn't fall apart, keeping it together because someone had to, and there was no one else. Her voice was steady, but her hands, flat on the table, pressed slightly against the wood. And then, the second year, I started to understand that that wasn't living, that Robert would have hated it. He would have looked at me holding myself so carefully and said, "Maggie, what are you doing? Put that down." She paused. He would have said it exactly like that. Sounds like someone I would have gotten along with, James said. She looked at him. You would have. He would have liked you very much. She said it simply, without weight, not complicated, just true. He would have liked the way you talk to Thomas, the way you listen before you say anything. She looked at her hands. The way you picked up my daughter in a snowbank and didn't put her down until she was warm. The kitchen was very still. James looked at the lamp. He thought about what he was going to say. And he thought about 4 years of not saying anything. And he thought about Thomas in the barn, telling him that his mother had laughed for the first time. And about Eliza's arms around his coat. And about the biscuits on the stove. And the letter. I found your flower, and your stores, and the bird on the shelf that Caroline had asked him to make, and that he had kept there 4 years without seeing it, until a 7-year-old asked him who it was for. I want to ask you something, he said. Margaret looked at him. I'm going to ask it plainly, he said, the same way I ask everything. And I want you to answer it the same way. No management, no composure, just what's true. All right, she said. He looked at her directly across the lamp. I want you to come back. Not to pass through. Not as a housekeeper or a worker or someone with an arrangement. I want you to come back as... He stopped. Found the right word. The only word. As mine. And I want Thomas and Eliza to have this ranch as theirs. And I want to stop calling this thing what we've been calling it, and call it what it already is. The kitchen held still. Margaret looked at him. She looked at him the way she had looked at him on the road the first night, that measuring, careful look. And then she looked at him the way she had not looked at him then, which was with everything unguarded, everything managed set down, just the truth of what was in her face. What does it already is, she said. Her voice was not quite steady. A family, he said. That's what it already is. The 4 of us. Whatever you want to call the official version of that, that's the part that's true. He held her eyes. And I'd like to make it official, if you want that too. The lamp flame moved in the cross-draft from the window. The shadows shifted. Margaret looked at him for a long time. Long enough that a man less certain of the ground would have started to fill the silence. James didn't fill it. He had learned from a very young age that the important silences needed to be let alone until they were ready to resolve. I fell in love with this kitchen, she said finally, very quietly. He waited. That first morning, when I came out and Eliza was in the chair, and you were at the stove, and you'd fed her eggs because she asked you, and you didn't make it a thing. She looked at the stove. I thought, this is a man who just does what's right. He doesn't think about it. He just does it. She looked back at him. And then I thought, I haven't been around that in a very long time. I forgot it existed. Her eyes were bright. And then I thought, I am in serious trouble. James felt something shift in his chest. Something that had been locked down for 4 years, the way a river locks down under ice, beginning to move. "You're not in trouble," he said. "No," she said. "I'm not. Not anymore." She held his gaze. The brightness in her eyes did not spill over. She was too much herself for that. But it was there. "Yes, James, yes, that's my answer. Yes to all of it." He reached across the table and took her hand, both of hers, bandaged and healed and working hands, the hands of a woman who had dug through snow and driven through blizzards and held her family together by sheer will for 14 months, inside his. That was all. Just her hands and his, in a kitchen that had been a grave for 4 years, and was not a grave anymore. They sat like that for a while, and neither of them needed to say anything else, because the thing itself was present and known and required no translation. Margaret went back to North Fork the next morning for Eliza. James rode with her. He had not planned to. He had been planning to stay and work the fence line and let her make the trip herself and come back when she was ready. But he woke before dawn and lay in the dark for 10 minutes, and then got up and saddled Buck and was at the door when she came out with her coat on. She looked at him. He looked at her. "North Fork's a full day's ride," she said. "I know how far it is." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. "You going to meet Helen?" "Appears so." "She's going to ask you questions." "I'll answer them." Margaret looked at him for one more moment. Then she nodded once and walked to the wagon, and he rode beside her up the road, and neither of them said much for the first several miles, which was its own kind of conversation. Eliza saw them from the window of her aunt's house before the wagon reached the gate. By the time James dismounted, she was already running across the yard with her coat half on and her boots improperly laced, and the specific momentum of a 7-year-old who has been waiting 4 days and has reached the end of her capacity to wait. She hit James at full speed, both arms around him, face into his coat. He caught her. He held on. "You came," she said into his coat. "I came. I told Mama you would." She pulled back to look at him, with complete vindication in her face. "I told her you weren't the kind of man who just says if you need something. I told her you were the kind of man who comes." James looked at her. "You were right." "I know." She looked at his horse. "Captain missed me." "He did," James said, which was true enough to say. Helen came out onto the porch, a solid, practical woman in her 40s, with Margaret's directness and a more visible version of it, the kind that had been allowed to develop without the weight Margaret had been carrying. She looked at James with the assessing gaze of a woman who loves her sister-in-law and has watched her be through hard things, and is now looking at the man standing in her yard to determine what kind of thing this is. James met her eyes. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Come in, I'll make coffee." He came in. She made coffee. She asked him 4 questions, direct, specific, not unkind. The questions of someone who needs to understand a thing before she can support it. He answered each one plainly, without managing the answers, which was the only way he answered anything. She listened. When he finished, she wrapped her hands around her cup and looked at him the way Ruth Hensley had looked at him the first morning. That specific recalibration of an expectation. Then she said, "Robert would have liked you." "So I've been told," James said. She almost smiled. He was direct too. It annoyed people who weren't used to it. She looked at Margaret. He was good for her. Good people are allowed to be good for each other more than once. She looked back at James. "That's what I believe. In case it matters to you what I believe." "It matters," he said. "Good." She stood and refilled his coffee without asking. "Then we understand each other." They started back to the ranch in the early afternoon, all four of them, James on Buck, Margaret driving the wagon, Thomas beside her, Eliza in the back, wrapped in 2 blankets, with her opinions about everything, and the inexhaustible conversational energy of a child who has been good and patient for 4 days and is now liberally spending the reserves. She talked about the dog Helen kept, and a boy at North Fork who had shown her how to throw a snowball properly, and a dream she'd had about Captain running in a field that had green grass in it, which didn't make sense in January, but was a good dream anyway. Thomas listened, and occasionally said, "Eliza," in the specific tone of an older brother, which she ignored with the practiced ease of someone who has been ignoring that tone her whole life. Margaret drove and looked at the road, and occasionally at James riding alongside the wagon. And when she looked at him, it was with the expression of a woman who has set something heavy down and is still getting used to the freedom of her own hands. James rode and thought about the ranch waiting at the end of the road. The new barn. The water channel running clean through land that was his. The north field with its creek access that Strand would keep trying to take and would keep failing to take because some things were not for sale at any price. The kitchen with the lamp and the stove, and the chair by the fire, and the carved wooden bird on the shelf above the window. He thought about what the ranch was going to be in a year, in 5 years, in 10. He thought about Thomas learning the North Field the way James had learned it, by walking every inch of it in every season until the land became readable, until you could feel in the quality of the grass and the behavior of the creek what the summer would bring, and how to prepare for it. He thought about Eliza naming every animal on the property with the systematic thoroughness of a child who understands that named things are cared-for things. He thought about Margaret at the kitchen table, writing letters with steady hands, and Margaret at the stove, and Margaret standing at the garden in spring with the particular look of a woman planning something, and Margaret beside him in the dark, looking at mountains that had held their watch through everything, and would hold it still. He thought, Caroline loved this view. She said it would make her believe in things. He thought, she was right. He thought, she is still right. Both things true. Both things held. The grief that did not go away, but changed shape, and the life that grew up around it like a tree grows up around a stone, not erasing it, just incorporating it, making it part of the structure. They reached the ranch gate as the sun was dropping toward the mountains. Eliza climbed down from the wagon before it fully stopped, which she had been told not to do many times, and went straight to the barn to see Captain, trailing one blanket behind her like a flag. Thomas went after her with the patient resignation of a brother. Their voices came back across the yard, Eliza narrating her return in full detail to the horse, Thomas saying, "Eliza," in that tone, the horse demonstrably indifferent to all of it. James dismounted. Margaret came around the wagon and stood beside him, and they both looked at the barn where the voices were, and the house behind them with the cold lamp in the kitchen window waiting to be lit, and the mountains beyond everything, doing what Montana mountains do. "Home," Eliza's voice said from inside the barn, not to anyone in particular. Just the word, said with the complete, uncomplicated certainty of a 7-year-old who has decided where home is and does not see any reason to complicate it further. James and Margaret stood in the yard and heard it. Margaret looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything. Because some things don't need to be said. Some things are already decided by the time you think to say them. Decided the way the important things always get decided. Not in a single moment, but in accumulation, in the daily weight of 100 ordinary choices that each meant the same thing, until the thing itself was simply true, and the only question left was whether you were going to say it out loud or just live inside it. They were going to live inside it. They were going to build on it, the way you build anything worth having. Not all at once, Not by one person, not without cost or difficulty, or the long, particular work of people who have been broken and decided to keep going anyway, but by accumulation, by showing up, by the daily choosing of the same true thing until the choosing becomes the life itself. Margaret walked toward the house. James walked beside her. Behind them, Thomas and Eliza's voices continued from the barn. The boy asking the girl to please stop climbing on the stall door. The girl explaining that Captain preferred it when she was at eye level. The horse offering no opinion. James opened the door. Margaret walked through it. He lit the lamp. The kitchen filled with light, warm and steady and sufficient, the way good things are. Not spectacular, not dramatic, just real and present and enough. The way a home is enough when it is finally, fully, a home. Outside, the Montana winter held its watch the way it always had. Enormous, patient, indifferent to the small, bright lives being lived in its shadow. The fires and the hearings, the long silences and the words finally spoken, the doors that closed and the one that opened, and what walked through it, all of it mattering completely. A family had been built here on this slope of land, out of loss and stubbornness and the specific grace of people who reached toward each other across the cold. And it would hold. It would hold for a very long time.